Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Well, hello and welcome back. Happy New Year. We're rocking right on. I know we're well into the new year. How's everybody doing? Hope that you all are doing okay and are staying healthy and happy. If you're new to the show, welcome. If you are returning and you have been a supporter and listener of the show for quite some time, welcome back and thank you so much for your support. As you know, I talk about abuse and different types of dynamics that go in abuse and pathology on this podcast and have been doing so for years. But today I thought I'd change it up a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about my career and just some things that I've noticed and I want to share with you, about my career, just sort of observations that I've made, things that I've learned kind of along the way in terms of, doing the work that I do. I have been working in the mental health profession. I went to grad school. I went to my first grad school, I should say, back in 2006. So, I started internship there in 2007, but I feel like I actually have been doing mental health work long before then. I had done work with the Humane Society. And that's actually, I feel like my first, job or first relevant experience in working in abuse dynamics is the Humane Society. And for those of you who don't know, the Humane Society was very pivotal for human rights and child labor laws. The Humane Society is the reason why we have laws against domestic violence today. As I've mentioned on the show before, because people were very passionate about animals and helping animals that have been mistreated. And so the Humane Society harnessed the power behind that and actually advocated for protection of human rights. And prior to them doing so, the odds were not very favorable for you if you found yourself in an abusive home or an abusive family environment. And so I want to thank them, for lobbying for that. There's still so much work to be done. But, and through my work with them, animals are a lot of times, I got to see firsthand in working with animals how they are usually amongst the first to be neglected or be abused because they don't talk back. They are very quickly seen as an inconvenience or an expense that people feel like they don't want to take on. And so a lot of times people will put their animals out quickly or dump them or leave them when they leave their apartments or homes or places that they're renting and just sort of leave them behind with things that they don't want because it's not an expense that they want to incur when they go on to their next destination. And I imagine, I don't know, I don't do too much work with the Humane Society, not like I used to, just because I don't have the time. I would eventually like to get back to it, but I would imagine today's time, and back then, I think I was working in the Humane Society maybe 2002, 2003-ish. And so when I was doing that, but I would imagine with the cost of inflation and rising rental costs, I would not be surprised if someone were to tell me that there's also a rise in animal abuse and animal neglect because of the expenses or the cost of inflation. Plus, our culture has changed a lot. When I was growing up back then, animals were like, I grew up in the country, and so we had animals that served a purpose. In today's society, we are very much a dog and cat culture. So everyone has a pet usually, or a lot of people do. And, it's gotten to the point now where people take their pets with them to restaurants, grocery stores, and everywhere. And when I was coming up, we didn't, it wasn't really like that. It wasn't so much of a culture like that. And so I say all that to say that animal ownership and companionship has grown exponentially. So I imagine with that growth, plus the rising cost of healthcare expenses for animals, just general upkeep, and then a lot of places you got to pay pet rent. Pet deposits, there's pet hotels if you can't take your animals with you, and pet daycare and things like that, things that are very expensive. So one thing that I have learned is that usually when there's abuse dynamics going on in the home, that will often show up in pets and animals, and unfortunately it happens all too often. Okay, so that's one thing that I will say there. I do court work a lot. I spent a huge portion of my career in corrections, and I've also worked in inpatient, substance abuse, along with a lot of other facilities. And so I'll just kind of, run through some things that just like some interesting tidbits that I can think of from there. Um, so I'll start with court work. And this is more of like a PSA, a public service announcement. And so one of the things that I will mention that I learned through doing court work is that be careful of technicians that you allow in your home. So if they have like, for example, the cable guy that's got to come and hook up your cable, or if there's, a problem with your cable, telephone, Verizon, whatever the case may be, because one thing I didn't know, but I very quickly learned through my work, is that those people can be felons. So they hire a lot of felons to do those types of jobs. And one thing that I've learned over my career in working with felons is that, you know, people oftentimes, when they're a felon, they don't usually just commit one felon and that's the felon that they're busted for. They're usually, they may be living a certain lifestyle and committing a whole slew of crimes, and then just kind of get caught up and convicted on whatever crime. But that's not, there may be a whole other slew of crimes that may not be on their jacket, or that they haven't been busted for. And a lot of times that can include sex crimes, that may include murder, or other violent crimes. So something that you should be aware of, and that you should be prepared for, is never allow a technician to come into your home without having some sort of protection or other people there with you, especially if you're elderly or vulnerable adult. Because they can be felon friendly, and there has been history of those types of people committing various sorts of crimes, serious offenses, and even murder against clients whose home that they've entered. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can just sort of Google lawsuits, and just in case you're thinking, oh, well, I have a big name, cable or internet or phone service. These are big name companies that usually hire people like that, and have gotten into various legal issues because of crimes that people that they've hired have committed in the homes of customers or consumers. And there's there's record of that, so you can do a simple Google search. But that's a PSA about that. One of the things that I will say in terms of working in mental health and just working with licensed practitioners is, or therapists or psychologists or and psychiatrists or any mental health professional really is not everyone that goes in this field needs to be in this field. And what I mean by that is sometimes what I've noticed, especially in recent years, and this again is a sign of times changing. Like, for example, when I started school way back when, it feels like a long time now, but really it's not. When I started, going into this field, it was understood that you would have a bachelor's, you would have a master's, and then you would have a doctorate, and you have to, do all this extensive work. You have to do all these internships. You have to do training in psychological assessment and testing, and you have to have years of experience in working with children, adult substance abuse. So you actually have to do extensive training when I was coming up. And so I did many different rotations in order to get that training. And so now that's not so much the case. And I feel like the APA, the American Counseling Associations, has a lot to do with that, as well as them sort of allowing the development of online schools and programmings, and also the state accreditation. So when you get licensed in the state, and what I mean by that is, APA and ACA and sort of organizations seem to be driven by money, as opposed to having the ethical standards that they used to. And what I've noticed, and I won't say that this is for all of online schools, but what I have noticed in recent years is they don't require the years of internships and things like that that APA accredited universities did back when I was growing up. There's a lot of schools now that are, very fast track, and you can sort of fast track your degree, or you can just do maybe 2 years worth of work, and then boom, you get a degree now. And so I'm noticing that there is a lot of that that's happening. And so what you have when you have that, how that looks on the back end, while it might sound great on the front end, because you may not have to, you could just pay and you can sort of fast track your way through. But what that looks like on the back end is you have people that are poor diagnosticians. You have people that kind of use mental health or psychology as a throwaway field. And what I mean by that is like, oh, I started out as like an English teacher, or I started out wanting to be a chemist and that didn't work out. So I just kind of do that, or this is just kind of a hobby and I'm kind of bored. So I'll kind of go to school for psychology, but it's not really a vested interest or passion. It's just more like, this is the easy thing that I could sort of do, and I'll just do it because it looks good. Um, and so although that may sound like I'm biased and I'm jaded, or you may feel like I have something, it does show up clinically when you're working with patient care, when you're working in institutions. You can see it very quickly in terms of report writing, diagnostics, assessments, and things like that, or lack of the ability to diagnose, lack of the ability to assess, lack of the ability to write a clinical report, and even the lack of ability to do therapy or have those interpersonal skills show up in the room, or even a lack of pleasure in doing the work, the clinical work or the teaching work, or whatever, in whatever capacity you do the field. There's just like, oh, well, I thought it was going to be like this quick and dirty thing, or I want my field to be easy and convenient, and this is not what I thought it was going to be, or I don't have this training and this background, or I've never heard of these things before because my school never required this, or this is all foreign to me. So you see a lot of that on the back end. And for some of us who've been in the field a lot longer, who've had like very stringent training, it shows up, and there's a lot of frustration within the field with people who are inept or ill-equipped to do a job or lacks basic fundamental skills within the field, if that makes sense. One of the things that I picked up on in sort of counseling clients or working with clients, and a lot of times, when people are sort of asking the question about narcissism and abuse and things like that, one of the things that I've usually found to be true more often than not is victims or survivors or however you would like to reference yourself if you've been through an abusive situations. Victims of abuse usually stay way too long. And by the time they end up leaving a relationship that's abusive, the consequences can be dire. And not only leaving, because I recognize and I understand that not everyone has the privilege to leave, or not everyone has the, can kind of get up and disconnect from their abuser, is that, people oftentimes don't reach out for assistance in terms of therapy or services until they are at their absolute worst and they are like in crisis mode and absolutely have nowhere to turn to. And so that's something to be mindful of, is that I always encourage people to, whenever you're feeling any sort of discomfort or what have you, if you can, reach out to a crisis line. There's domestic violence lines. There's 988, the suicide crisis line. There is community-based mental health. Every county, most counties, I won't say every county, but most counties have community-based mental health resources. So check within your county, as well as there's so many support and resources online. And so I always encourage people to reach out sooner than later. When it comes to pathology, and again, I've talked a lot about like borderline personality disorder, or I haven't talked about as borderline as much, but I have worked a lot with borderline personality disorder. So when you think about the pathology of like borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, when you think about the cluster B, is what the old school folks call them, the cluster B personality disorders, there's a lot of pathology within the mental health field itself, believe it or not. And there have been many, many professionals that I've worked with over the years that the pathology oftentimes shows up in their clinical work. I have encountered many health professionals that don't have good boundaries, and I won't say this is a majority, but it's enough to be of a concern. And it's one of the reasons why your state licensing board and national licensing board, says that sex with clients is not appropriate, and other brochures that they may have for clients that want to file a complaint against the clinician that's working with them, is because there are so many clinicians in the field that have some diagnostic pathology, but also that kind of goes along with the diagnostic pathology, is they have poor boundaries. And I encountered probably the poorest of boundaries when I've worked in corrections. So you have clinicians that will lose their license or jeopardize losing their license to, bring in substances, bring in phones, have romantic relationships with inmates and things like that. So that's always interesting to me, to see that. And so I'll just move on to corrections in general. In corrections, one of the things that I found is that even if you connect with people that you work with, you really don't have friends and connections. Friends and corrections, it's like an understood rule that, in the correctional facility, we might hang out every now and then, we might socialize, but, we're not really friends. And, so that's something to keep in mind that, that there can be predators in corrections. So, one of the ways that this shows up in corrections and in law enforcement in general is there's, and I may get a little bit of flack for this, but a lot of times, and I think I spoke about this in the Women Who Seek Validation podcast, is a lot of times when people come to work in those types of fields, whether they're married, have families, or whatever, a lot of times when they get to work, they are single or they have a relationship with someone else. And that includes even if their spouse works in corrections with them, because they seek validation. And it's almost like, a frat house or sorority party. And then it's kind of like these people, they sort of carry on these relationships that are inappropriate with each other. And then they kind of talk about it. So if someone's done something with someone, or they have a relationship, or if they're fraternizing with someone, even if they're married, everybody knows about it. It's kind of like, people can't wait to come to work and show and tell. And I got to tell you, that's one part of the culture that I don't miss. I always cared about my career way too much to kind of get involved in that stuff. But you see it all the time where people may end up pregnant or something happens, and it can get very just out of hand very quickly. A lot of times in law enforcement or in corrections, there is one of the reasons that the correctional officers have a lot of dislike for mental health or psychologists, or, they have a lot of just sort of this disdain for mental health clinicians. And one of the reasons is because when you work in mental health, if a correctional officer or a police officer, or any person in that line of work, really, even in the military, if they have to go see someone in mental health, so if there's some concerns with their mental health stability, or anything like that, their safety or their etiquette or anything like that on their job, they can become at risk for losing their job. Or if there's any sort of recommendation for mental health about that, they may be taken from their job, or they may lose the ability to use their service weapon, aka their gun. And so anytime there's a threat of another personnel being able to recommend someone carrying a firearm or having access to firearms, that is a threat to, they feel like it's a threat directly to their position of power. And so there's automatically that sort of negative connotation between mental health and corrections. One of the things that I learned, and I was on the union when I was there, I was all about my job when I was there. But one of the concerns that I have with corrections, and I can't say this is for all corrections, but I can say this was for what I found from my job and where I worked. But one of the concerns that I have is fatalities with officers who have access to firearms, specifically people who commit suicide or murder suicide. That's typically unpublished information, or information where you can't get access to all of the numbers. They don't like to release that information. However, it does happen quite a bit. One of the concerns that I always had is that anytime you have someone that has access to weapons or firearms, they should be undergoing mental health evaluations and be checking in with a mental health professional regularly, because of the lethality involved in that, the dangerousness. And just from my personal experience in working in corrections, knowing how dangerous a person can be within the correctional field just from the act of carrying a firearm. There was a significant number of suicide/murder suicides, so violent incidences involving guns. And it's always concerning to me when these people have access to them, they may carry them, or may utilize them at work, but they don't have ongoing evaluations, at a minimum of once or twice a year. So they may go years, without ever talking to someone or seeing someone or being assessed, for any sort of mental health challenges or, risk of violence or things like that. And that's always concerning to me, because that's a real risk. I consider myself a very good diagnostician. And what that means is like being able to flesh out a diagnosis. One of the things that essentially everyone has access to, including inmates, but everyone has access to the diagnostic and statistical manual. And so a lot of times when people want something, if they are malingering, if they want to get some sort of perk or benefit or some sort of preferential treatment, they will study diagnosis, and they will study the diagnostic and statistical manual and sort of try to present like, what they've studied and try to research and study, those. And that's, so you have to be good at sort of fleshing those out, and calling, not only just fleshing out diagnostics, but calling people on their stuff, right? And there's a way that you can call out someone who may be antisocial or narcissistic on feigning symptoms. You've got to be able to finesse it, and it doesn't work with everybody. But you got to be able to sort of call people out and say, something is inappropriate, or no, you can't get this, no matter what you're trying to do. Um, However, with that being said, there's a caveat, especially when you're working for a state agency. There are restrictions, and there's red tape that you got to go through. One of the restrictions is every now and then, it doesn't happen often, but every now and then I have encountered someone that it's not worth it to kind of, you just kind of have to give them what they want, even though may be pushing it. In the world of psychopathy and sociopathy, there are people that will go to such extremes to get what they want, that it's not worth it to get into a battle with them. And it's what I mean when I say people will go through extremes to get what they want, even though that the mental health symptoms aren't aligning, is that someone may, you know, if they, for example, they may say, "Hey, I'm suicidal," and they may actually go through with a serious threat, to show that they're suicidal. And I don't mean like a scratch or anything like that, which back in the old days we call that a gesture. I mean, like, no, someone is gonna, do some serious slashing, and, of something, or may act out very violently towards someone, or they may, cut off a piece of something, or do something that's very extreme to show that, I'm gonna get what I want by any means necessary. And I want to get some preferential treatment. I have a long time to do here, right? I have a long sentence, that I have to do in corrections. So I'm gonna try to make this ride, or this bit of time, as easy for myself as possible. And if that means I have to do something extreme in order to get that, that's what I'm gonna do. And so those are people that are willing to push the envelope, because they got to do the time, and they want what they want, by any means necessary. And so that's always a person that's extremely dangerous. And so there's just some thought to be considered for that. So hopefully that makes sense. And so what I mean when I say that, if, for example, someone says, I can't tolerate something, maybe that was a bad example, the suicide. But if someone says, I'm depressed, or I just can't handle it here, And they're not presenting with any symptoms of depression, but instead they lash out and they become so violent with someone, right? And so they may lash out and do something so violent that they're put in a period of isolation for a long time, just so they can have their own space where they don't have to do time in a crowd of people, if that makes sense. I know I have a lot of clinicians that watch this or listen to this podcast, but one of the diagnoses that may come up from time to time is dissociative identity disorder in corrections. Now, dissociative identity disorder is formerly known as multiple personality disorder. And dissociative identity disorder, it's kind of like you show me a clinician that diagnoses a patient with dissociative identity disorder in prison or in corrections or in the forensic field. I'll show you someone who's getting manipulated. And so that's kind of like a thing where, going back to what I was saying before about how some people will study diagnostic manuals and, really research that. But dissociative identity, like when you think of like the classic movie like Sybil and things like that, usually if someone is diagnosing someone, and if a clinician is diagnosing someone in corrections with that, they are getting manipulated. That's been my experience. In that, and I've known inmates pretty well that get that diagnostics. And again, they're kind of willing to sort of do things in order to get specific perks and benefits. And so, with that being said, manipulation of clinicians, just manipulation and stalking and gaslighting and things like that do not stop happening with people because they are locked up. Those are things that they take with them through their time. If they're predators on the outside, they're going to still be predators on the inside. It just means they have to come against other people who are predatory. So they have to prove who's the biggest one. But there are people, but in prison, DID is not a diagnosis, typically a genuine diagnosis. And if a clinician is diagnosing that, their clinical work needs to be looked at, because you have to look at their rationale. You have to, really review the documentation. And a lot of times in corrections, there's just not a lot of time and there's so much red tape, meaning that, we often have to do a lot of clinical work, like note taking and report writing and assessments and evaluations, but there's not a lot of time to do that. And you have to usually see a lot of guys or a lot of people, women, guys, inmates or patients or whatever. And so people will just do, quick and dirty and just kind of go with it a lot of times due to the time constraints that they have to get work done and the large volume of work that they have to get done. I can't say that for every facility. I can only speak about my facility, but just the general consensus, and even me talking to other facilities, we're all kind of faced with the same things: large volume, little time, and high expectations to get things done in a short frame of time. And so people may cut corners with work and just sort of, kind of put things out there. Here's a little, thing that I'll put out there too. More of like a high, like I didn't know this was like a thing. Just like a little random fact. There are a lot of men who are addicted to feet. I found that out when I worked in corrections. They have foot fetishes, and it doesn't matter what kind of feet you have, they are addicted to feet. And that's inmates and that's people who work there. There's a lot of people. I won't say every man, but a lot of men that I've worked with have foot fetishes, and they look at the shoes, they listen to the sound of the shoes, they look at the feet, everything sort of involving the foot. The how big or small, if your feet are fat, chunky toes, whatever. There's like, um, just this like weird obsession with feet. And that was just like something that was very surprising to me. Just how like Feet are the highlight of a lot of people's day. And I'm not even joking about that. And that was just something like totally random that I found out. And I was just like, wow, that's really a thing. I thought that was just like, something, but there are a lot of men that are really into feet, shoes, what are on your feet, how your feet look. And, it's a weird thing. So just FYI about that, that is actually a real thing. One of the things that I've noticed is too that there's if you've been in this field long enough, you will see what I like to call diagnostic fads. A fad is something where it seems like every few years or so, it seems like everyone has a diagnosis. And it's just like this influx where it's like everyone has this diagnosis, everyone has that diagnosis. And there are diagnostic fads. And I like to, call out one of them that, that I think is a diagnostic fad and that is way overly and incorrectly diagnosed is attention deficit disorder or ADHD, as I like to call it in adulthood. You see that a lot where, where people are just like, oh, I have this inattentiveness or I have this inability to concentrate, and now they have this diagnosis. What I have learned, just for me, and, some people may disagree with me, and that's okay. But, especially when looking over reports and things like that, I mean, a lot of times people who grew up in highly chaotic and highly abusive homes, they tend to struggle with the same, things. So clinically, scores on certain batteries of tests and things like that are going to look very similar, or challenges that they may have in certain areas are also going to be very similar and overlap. So, for example, if you grew up in a very volatile home, people are going to have trouble with you know, processing things or sitting still or feeling anxious or even procrastinating because, a lot of times when they have to study, if they can study or they can read or can focus on an activity, a lot of times they have to do it under duress or in the middle of chaos. And so, sometimes, I think there's a lot of overlap or a lot of diagnostic fads there. And I think that one of the one of the things that I've learned in terms of working with people, and it doesn't always happen, and I'm certainly not, I'm not trying to contest anybody about their diagnosis because I'll leave that up to you and their mental health professional. But certain times, a lot of times, certain conditions may need to change in order for you to be able to work more effectively. And, in my work in corrections, I did work a lot with inmates, like in school or with how they were approaching, homework or things like that. And a lot of times those symptoms were able to balance themselves out as long as expectations were clear, and there was a mutual respect there. And we worked a lot on how to calm your nervous system, your central nervous system down. So calm that down and learn how to, work through things. And they would do that in my presence and both, and their, so just as an FYI, for me, I feel like a lot of times things can be overly diagnosed. In the APA, American Psychological Association, for adults, when you were looking at ADHD, the APA says that, traditionally speaking, hyperactivity usually fades. If you were diagnosed with ADHD as a child, that hyperactivity usually fades. And when you reach adulthood, and then it becomes more of the inattentive type of ADHD. So for that, it's not like when you're diagnostically, and I always go back to my diagnostic hat, is going to present a little bit differently. But I think whenever you're flushing out diagnoses like that, you have to look and assess and evaluate for trauma, lifelong history of trauma, and things like that, because I think those things go hand in hand. I don't know. I just feel like that diagnosis in particular, there needs to be more work or criteria around diagnosing someone with that, because I think there's more weight given to that as opposed to the effects, long term effects of trauma on people, if that makes sense. When I think about all of the victims that I've worked with over the years, a lot of the work that I've done have been with men more so than women. Although I think maybe now there's more of a equitable distribution of males and females that I see. But when I think about that, one of the things that I want to point out, and especially in doing court work and working in corrections or just this, even working with foster youth and or youth that were in group homes. One of the things that I found consistently over my career is when I'm working with victims, boys and men are much less likely to come forward, or ask for help and talk about things that happened to them. There's usually like an extenuating circumstance, and even then, it takes a lot to sort of pull out how they've been victimized. There can be such an intense level of shame that men are usually willing to take things with them. To the grave, and even I've worked on court cases where I have to evaluate a man who's been sexually assaulted or, and they do not, and I'm certainly not trying to undermine how hard it is for any victim, but when I think about, just the amount of services, how can I put this in the right way? And I want to put this in a way that's both sensitive and speaks to the realism of what is the reality in the world that we face. When you think about victimization, like even domestic violence, or you think about sexual assault, or when you think about any of that, it's much more socially acceptable for a woman to come forward, a woman or a girl to come forward and say that she's been assaulted. And that's not to say that we don't that they don't have their own difficulties, but when it's a man, there's just so much stigma, and a lot of times, and the reason I'm saying that is because what I've noticed that even in men that, that I work with, and they have to kind of get these court assessments and things like that, or even in corrections, and they've sort of done all these things, is the internalization of a severe trauma, sexual trauma, often leads to a severe pathology on the back end. Um, and what I found is that men who's experienced sexual assault but may never have talked about it, that is, they can oftentimes go to the pipeline. They often make that pipeline to prison route, and so they may self-destruct, they may self-sabotage, they may become violent, they may join a gang, they may act out and become violent, predatory towards other people, but they oftentimes also internalize being guarded and paranoid and don't want necessarily anyone to get close to them. They may have what a lot of people call homophobia, or they may be triggered by homosexuality, or whether it's on television or in real life, or even within their family, where they could get triggered by it because of, and I know that this is a hot button for a lot of people, and I don't want to get into a debate on this podcast about this and that. I'm just telling you what is from my experience, that men who identify as heterosexual but have been sexually assaulted as children or even as men, they grapple with these issues. And again, may become paranoid and very guarded about, people being in in their own space. They are oftentimes fearful of other men, and that may cause them, and oftentimes does cause them, to lash out violently. And I found that in the case where men murder other men, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times there is a history of assault. And so they have this paranoia, or they don't like, when men sort of aggress towards them in a way, or they may become highly aggressive if they feel like a man is being inappropriate or making a move that's a little bit funny or out of the norm. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's one of the things that I have noticed about men typically. And I will say, even I've worked with a lot of women or female victims too, and that's not usually the case with them. They may have paranoia, they may be fearful. What they don't have a history of becoming violent or lethal towards someone else. With women, what they have a history of is, if they've experienced assault, especially at a young age, is they have a history of being assaulted multiple times over the years by different partners or different predators. So unfortunately, their history is led them to be more likely to be aggressed against or be in another abusive relationship. Whereas men, I won't say that that's not the case for men, but a lot of times they will isolate, but they will oftentimes become hyper aggressive, um, uh, you know, with other men, when they feel uncomfortable, which may cause them to react very violently. And one last little tidbit that I will leave you with, that my career has taught me over the years, and I just threw a bunch of random things out there. So hopefully you guys like this and it wasn't too hard to track. But one good note that I will leave you with is, I'm very blessed and fortunate to have my career, and I've really enjoyed it over the years. It's really taught me a lot. There's not a lot of people that look like me in my field, especially the higher you go in my field. What I will say is, I feel like my field of psychology, clinical psychology, um, I love this field so much. And I am one of those people that grew up knowing what I wanted to be at a very young age. I was like, yep, that's exactly what I wanted to be. I don't know that my expectation of my career was realistic, because, when I grew up and I was like, this is what I want to be, I thought all you had to do was talk to people all day and get paid. But that's actually only maybe 25%. Maybe I think most of my career is writing. I will say that, even clinically, a lot of it is writing and justification, legal justifications for what you write. You always have to write like you have an attorney looking over your shoulder. That's another thing that, you may not have if, again, that was one thing that they sort of hammered into me in my training. But anyhow, moving on. Uh, One of the things I like about my career is it allows me to be very diverse and versatile and wear many different hats. So, I can write, podcasting, writing, doing clinical work. Again, like I said, I've worked in many different fields, from inpatient to psych emergency to rehabilitation to skilled nursing to hospice to substance abuse to residential, to corrections and, court and private practice and so on and so forth. And the list goes on, because I've had multiple other jobs in addition to that. And so what I feel like within my field, there's so much to do, and I can change at any time, and sort of change directions, because there's so many different things that I can do with my career. And that's I think that's one of the things that I love most about my career, as well as, I get to work with a lot of different people, a lot of interesting people. I have learned so much from the people that I work with, and vice versa. So, that's the other thing to think about, is like, I know that when people come to therapy, or, when therapists or clinicians help them, I know that people may think it's a one-way street. It's like, your therapist's helping me and blah, blah, blah. But, I think it's a two-way street. I think, we learn from each other, and it's just sort of helped me to evolve and navigate the world as a person. And it's allowed me to be more open in terms of just the people that I work with, and just what I see in the world. And it's allowed me to see what real people are faced with. One of the other last little tidbits I will leave you with is a little fun fact. This is something that I did not know and would have never guessed it prior to coming into the field that I do. Reality TV is more of a thing again than it was when I was coming up in this field. But when I was coming up in this field, or when I was just kind of evolving through this field, and I would watch reality TV sometimes. I don't watch it so much anymore, or TV in general anymore. But I always thought it was, like, scripted and fake, and that people on reality shows were just, like, paid actors that were just there for entertainment. What I will say from working in the mental health field and having worked with reality TV people, those people, that you may see on the show that have, like, these extreme personalities, or they just sort of do these extreme things, they are not acting. If someone is typically presenting on a TV show, a reality TV show, is having an extreme personality or having some mental challenges or substance challenges, I can say that a show is not scripted, but what I will say is those personalities typically are not. Um, and that's one of the reasons that I look at reality TV a little bit differently, is because, these are people that I know that have bona fide challenges. And so I feel like in some ways that, like, um, their challenges are exploited, for entertainment. And that's not a good thing. And so that's always been troubling to me when, especially if you go back and look at reality TV from, when I was growing up in, like, the early 2000s, or when it was, like, really becoming a thing in the early 2000s, is what I'll say. It's like, back then TV was, like, completely unhinged and uncensored. So some of the stuff that they let go on was so very extreme. And so that's one of the things that I'll say about that, is like, wow, those people were really struggling with some things, and they just kept rolling the tape, and we watch it, and that is not an act. So that's something, a little fun tidbit that I'll throw out there. And working in TV, I've done that, and that's been fun, and I want to do more of that for sure. So anyhow, I hope this show has been interesting. I know it's been, like, a little bit different than what I normally do. And so what I'll do is I'll publish this episode as, like, a little bit of a little bonus for you, and just kind of throw it in there. You guys tell me what you think. Love to hear your comments. Drop them down on social media or on YouTube. And if you want to support a small podcast, definitely like, subscribe, share, leave a comment on Apple, iTunes, and that would be awesome, because that helps people to find the show. And thanks for sending me all of your questions. I really appreciate it. I do try to respond to all of them. Sometimes people reach out to me on various platforms, and I can't always get back to them in a timely manner. Especially, over the past month, I was sick there for quite a bit. So it's taken me a minute to get back on my feet and kind of get back to everybody. But trust and believe, I do read and reach back out to everybody. So I enjoy all the feedback. And until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and be well. Bye for now.